Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm really glad that we meet here today, and I'm happy that Jozef accepted my invitation to hold this short lecture on this topic, the Western canon in sociology. I thought that it may be important to us to talk about this question, since many students here are students in global and transnational sociology programs, so it's really relevant to us. As we planned, Jozef will hold a presentation around 50 minutes, and then there will be a chance for a conversation. You can ask questions. If you are shy, as I am usually, you can use the chat box, so this will be not a problem. And as you can see, there's a recording also. So I shamelessly copied a short bio of Jozef. He's a global historical sociologist and a professor of sociology at Rutgers University, United States of America. His main current interests include post-state socialisms, historical sociology, global structures, comparative historical analysis of capitalisms, the performing arts, race, sin and crime, and what comes after post-colonial critique. And he's teaching or taught a couple of courses, just to name a few: classical sociological theory, global structures, social change, Eastern enlargement of the European Union, economic sociology, and so on. So I give the virtual floor to you, Jozef.
Thank you, Attila, and welcome to you all, or thank you for welcoming me, I guess, since it's essentially your scene. I'm very glad to be doing this. I hope it's okay that I'm going to spend most of the visual part of the event with my slides, which I'm going to try to share, and that will be now. I hope it's visible. Is it? Okay. All right. So look, the history of this is that as a sociologist in the Department of Sociology at Rutgers, and being from Hungary and being interested in historical sociology, I was asked to teach classical sociological theory, both undergraduate and graduate levels, very early on in the department. And this lecture came out of one of the introductions to that class. In fact, I asked Attila to share some of the recordings, so the introductory recordings for that class. If somebody watched them or looked at them, some of this might seem familiar, although I must say that I'm not reproducing that one-to-one. There will be new material here. And then, starting this early February, 4 other colleagues of mine in Budapest started an open university online around the journal Replica. and this lecture, the one I'm actually giving you, is literally that lecture with English subtitles, or I hope English subtitles, because I spent a large part of yesterday and today trying feverishly to replace the Hungarian captions or whatever texts with English ones. I'm sure I failed in that. I'm sure there'll be some Hungarian here, but I hope you all forgive me. All right, so anyway, what I want to say or to talk about is not identity politics. What I mean by that is that I'm going to be pretty critical of Western sociology, its ability to comprehend societies outside the West. I'm saying this not because I feel that there needs to be, we all need to be represented somehow in Western sociology. Actually, it is quite the other way around. I don't really care, but as such. But my point is that Western sociology is not accurate in its universality claims, and that is a really important professional problem. In other words, the message of the lecture is that that there are serious problems with the ability of Western sociology to see societies as they are outside Western Europe. And that is all the worse for Western sociology. Of course, toward the end, I'll get into the business of talking about what this does to those of us who are not in the West and from the West and not working on the West. And that's not going to be necessarily nice either. So without further ado, if you really take a class on classical sociological theory, you will be basically told that sociology as we know it emerged in Europe. Actually, it was more like Western Europe, somewhere in the middle of the 19th or like second half of the 19th century. Now, saying I just give you two coordinates, time and space, and that already brings a couple of interesting issues to the fore. First of all, humankind has been pretty much settled for about 12,000 or so years. So the beginning of settled agriculture and the state go back to about 10,000 BC. And so we have arguably things that could be and should be called societies, at least for 12,000 years. Actually, my preference would be to go actually vastly farther back, because I really don't see why we shouldn't call the migratory tribal societies that were roaming before settled agriculture societies either, but at least 12,000 years is a safe approach. And so within that 12,000 year period, there is only about 500 years that is covered by capitalism, a combination of three things actually: capitalism, the colonial system, and modernity. These are actually terms that are so coterminous that they can almost be used interchangeably. Not really, but they're closely tied. By the way, when I teach this class in an undergraduate level, this is the point when the students really get the first shock, because the American media basically presents the world to them in such a way that capitalism is eternal. And so I just tell them that, oh, basically it's only the last 500 years, and usually for quite a few of those other students, that's comes as a surprise. Anyway, I'm sure it's not a surprise to you. And so within that, if you look at sociology in time, then even of that 500-year period, it was essentially in the penultimate century, the 19th century, sort of the beginning. So now, having just done this really stupid and simple little exercise, it appears rather unlikely that nobody, not even a single person, has ever written systematically, with care and in good quality, about social structure, the rules of social life, the emergence of social forms, etc., during the 18,850 years that preceded Western sociology. And it is also extremely unlikely that nobody outside Western Europe ever wrote societies in a systematic fashion. Then, if they did, which is almost certain, how come we don't acknowledge them? How come we don't talk about them? I want this question to be hanging, and we'll come back to some conversation about them. Now, part of the explanation for this is that sociology, of course, as we all know, is rooted in the history of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is sort of a product of what Habermas called the project of the Enlightenment. Enlightenment was an anticipatory rhetoric. It was referring to the future, the possibility of the betterment of the human condition through science. And it did a lot of interesting things. For instance, it replaced divine authority as the overarching organizing principle of life. And when it did so, Enlightenment thinkers experienced a certain kind of moral crisis and tried desperately to find another principle that they could, once they took out divinity of the picture, they could find some other organizing principle. And what they came up with were basically something that is now professionally called Western models of history. These are basically schemas, schematic imaginations of the ways in which social change, or a more grandiose way, history, is supposed to unfold. It is essentially a number of fairly rudimentary, elementary forms of change that we, so all of us children of the Western Enlightenment, are supposed to recognize and understand. The first one of those is something that is conventionally called progress. Progress is an infinitesimally small, gradual, quantitative betterment. Basically, tiny, tiny particles of growth from 1 year to, from 1 month, 1 day, 1 minute to another. It's pairwise combination, its other, so to speak, I'm going to call rupture. Rupture is, if progress is a quantitative improvement, change, rupture is a qualitative break. Rupture is a qualitative transformation, so much so that it's the two, how should I say, states of the world that are separated by rupture, here represented by a black circle and a red square with a hash plus hash pattern here, cannot be compared to each other except for one purpose. And that purpose is to show that they're different, that they're so different that there's nothing in common among them. Of course, I'm sure you recognize that the imagined pattern of a revolution fits this bill, so to speak. Now, I should probably go ahead and point it out that, of course, these two, progress and rupture, are truly rudimentary, and people have come up with various combinations thereof. One of the most popular and widely used combinations is called the stages view of history. It's interesting to know that, people from all kinds of ideological background, social scientists, Marxists, as well as Weberians and Durkheimians and many others, have used the stages model. The stages model is a combination of progress and rupture, in the sense that it's essentially the stages model consists of plateaus, basically periods of relative stagnation, followed by a break, meaning a rupture, and then another plateau. But the second plateau has a certain relationship to the previous plateau. You see what I'm trying to show with the cursor here, namely that the second plateau is higher. And so when you actually add up, sort of add together for instance, in Marx, this is called modes of production, then the pattern that emerges from all that is that of progress. So progress actually emerges in the grand scheme of stages model, right? Whereas it is made up of periodic, repeated events of rupture. A third, just for sake of completeness, a third model of change that is recognized is widely called time series. The time series model, those of you that work in quantitative fields, I'm sure you have not only heard of this, but have learned how to analyze this and how to work with time series, is an extremely useful technique. Essentially, it involves measuring the same item time and time again with time periods that are equal, equidistant periods. So it is a fantastic tool, for instance, for public administration and for planning purposes, for business as well as for municipalities and states, but also for various other purposes. Even families can use a time series idea of their own lives. But I should point it out that there is not much of an intellectual content to time series. It essentially only has one serious thing that it tells us, and that is that there is no time travel. In other words, this whole thing has one direction, and that is from the left to the right, from the past to the present, to the future. And finally, something I call the palette. The palette is this tool that painters use to work out the colors before they put it on canvas. The palette I'm using here because it gives us a nice metaphor for something that is chaotic, happy, unrestrained. Anything's possible. All kinds of things can be mishmashed together, including, by the way, as in the post-structuralist modality of various attempts to create social sciences after structuralism, including time travel. Now, the interesting thing is that the Western social sciences, without fail, have combined these models with something that is called teleology, a teleological frame. Teleology, Greek expression, I'm sure you have all studied this in some kind of philosophy. This must be a very, I certainly learned it in Introduction to Philosophy when I was a student in the humanities back in Hungary. Teleology is an explanation of the world in terms of the purpose, the end goal that they serve, rather than the cause by which they arise. Okay, so now teleology in the Western social sciences, it takes the following, sort of operates through the following system of interlocking background assumptions. Interlocking background assumptions. Okay. First, the assumption that world history, or another language that is used is social change in its totality, has a direction. I can call it an ontological optimism. The second is that it is possible to know that direction. I call it an epistemological optimism. Third, not only is it the case that world history has a direction, not only is it possible to know that direction, but guess what? We actually know that direction. That's a really, how should I say, conceited claim. Many of us make that claim. So the third one is the epistemological hubris of claiming that we know the direction of human history. And finally, if and when, as it almost in its origin always was, this claim was made from a Western identity position, that not only is there a history to global social change, not only is it possible to know that direction, not even only is it the case that we know that direction, but it actually points at us. It's a tough job, but somebody's got to do it, you know? Somebody has to be at the top, and so we'll volunteer to be the best. That is basically the Western approach. Of course, they don't make it so lightly. Or if they said it so lightly, I would like it very much. I mean, I would laugh a good laugh and move on. But unfortunately, a lot of ink has been spilled around this very last point. So the last claim is that the West, the Western subject who is doing the analysis, are the telos of history. It's never going to get any better than us. And that, of course, I call an ontological hubris. Now, turning this back to the previous conversation, there were four models of history. The first two, progress and rupture and their combination, the stages model, operate with a known telos, the claim of knowing the telos. The third one, the time series one, has an implied telos. It really doesn't say much about it, doesn't make much of that claim, but because it is methodologically not permitted to assume time travel, meaning reverse direction, therefore it has a telos only, it is implied. Right? And finally, the palette is a theoretical approach that makes the daring claim that there is no telos, it denies telos. And that brings us to another sort of subchapter of this conversation. And for the illustration I have for that comes from a book by Charles Darwin, The Origin of Species, which was published in 1859. It is very difficult today to how should I say, to feel the impact of that book on West European and actually all over Europe, European societies. This is the only graph in that book, and I'm going to use a version of it. But before I move on, so I actually put a contemporary, meaning then, cartoon of Darwin. He was not necessarily the most popular man, certainly not among the Christian conservative right. Anyway, really the important thing to note is that Darwin's theory of evolution, and so including this evolutionary tree, as it is called, this graph, is an emphatically non-teleological model. There is no known or implied telos to evolution. That is not the point. In fact, the point is exactly the opposite. Darwin was adamant about the fact that it is not possible to know ahead of time what the outcome of an evolutionary process will be. And he was also absolutely adamant about pointing it out repeatedly, that this is for species biological evolution, not made for modeling human history. And that, of course, didn't stop people very soon thereafter to do just that, to take Darwin's language and fill it with a teleological content and applying it to human history. That vulgarity, the vulgarity of applying, and the evolutionary theory of Darwin and the tree, as we're going to see, to human history in a teleological framework, was committed by the inventors of what is called the social, extremely very erroneously named social Darwinism. It's neither social nor Darwinist, actually. So, you know, I would just be anti-social, anti-Darwinism would be perhaps a more honest name for this perspective, which was, by the way, as an interesting aside, an immediate intellectual forerunner for today's neoliberalism worldwide. It's rarely pointed out. I'm not sure why the left fails to point this out. Anyway, there's a nice little cartoon here, which I really like. And that is, you know, this old man with his umbrella, with the name Darwin on the top of this, above the door, says, "Get out of the house," to laissez-faire and eugenics. Should remember that today. Anyway, so I'm going to use from now on for a while the so-called social Darwinist model as it was pretty much presented by Herbert Spencer. This graph, the one I'm showing you now, is the same as this one was. Oops, maybe this should go one more. This one, the only difference is that I turned it around by 90 degrees because there's going to be some manipulations here that are easier to do for me this way. Anyway, so the logic of the graph is that, according to these guys, human societies go back to this dark, unknown past, time immemorial. We really don't know how far, but very far. The direction from left to right, represented by this dashed line at the bottom, is the progression of time. The right-hand side, oops, where is my cursor here? The right-hand side of this graph here, so the edge of the graph, is the present. Oops, here's my first typo that I didn't catch, but anyway, never mind that. So these lines are essentially the lines of through which each of the contemporary patterns of cultures, societies, nations, states, and so on have arrived from the time immemorial in the dark past. So these guys here departed from the rest of the crowd right here and then took their own path and they ended up here. And so they are in the present, but they are here. Whereas, I don't know, let's say these guys, they went along with a bunch of them, kept going, and then at a certain point they took off and they ended up here, right? This is basically the schematic representation of an evolutionary pattern, okay? Now, why am I paying so much attention to this? Well, Western social sciences in the post-Enlightenment sort of, or extreme Enlightenment modality, perform a number of operations on this model. The first operation is that they appoint one position among all the contemporary positions. Remember, this is all the present, right? All of this is now. Choose one and appoint that as two things at once. One, they appoint it as the top achiever, the best of the best. And the second thing, they appoint it as their own identity position. The most concise description of this I found in the work of Aníbal Quijano, the really famous paper, Coloniality of Power, Eurocentrism in Latin America, 21 years ago. The foundational myth of the Eurocentric version of modernity is the idea of the state of nature as a point of departure for the civilized course of history, whose culmination is European or Western civilization. From this myth originated the Eurocentric evolutionist perspective of linear and unidirectional movement and changes in human history. Interestingly enough, this myth was associated with the racial and spatial classification of the world's population. Nice, concise. It's exactly the point of departure for the rest of this argument that I'm going to present. So remember, here is what has already been done. Here is that the Spencerian global evolution model has been adopted, and one point within that, namely the top achiever, has been designated as such and appointed as the identity location of the analyst. And so, in that sense, with respect to all other societies of the world, this guy here is the peak achievement, and the identity narrative of the speaker is, for the better or worse, the telos. It's a tough job, somebody's got to do it. If we appoint this particular location as the peak achievement and the identity narrative of the speaker, what follows from that is that the path that has led to this location from the dark times immemorial in the murky past is now somehow more important. This path here is more important than all other paths. Why? Because it led to the peak achievement that also happens to be the achievement of the analyst. So where I'm going to call it from now, the supposedly main path of human history. The main path of human history leads from the dark times immemorial to the top achiever, who happens to be the speaker. Every other path is inferior to that. And here comes, I apologize, it's a really complicated graph, no need to be scared. There are three bearded men here. This one we've seen, that's Spencer. So what I'm going to use here is basically a gist of the work of this great historical anthropologist, German-born historical anthropologist who lived his entire professional life in Amsterdam by the name Johannes Fabian. In his book Time and the Other, How Anthropology Makes Its Object, he makes the argument that he doesn't quite necessarily base it on Durkheim, but it is exactly a description of what Durkheim does in his own sociology of what he calls the religious life. And so I put Durkheim here also. Now, what is that? Well, that the best way to describe it is that the Western analyst chooses what Durkheim called the simplest and most primitive form of society, which is, of course, in every possible way, the farthest away from the top achievement, which happens to be his own. And in the case of Durkheim's book, it was the Australian Aborigine religion. Takes that and interprets that intellectually through intellectual process as an unchanged archaeological specimen from the dark times. In other words, moves these guys from the present intellectually through interpretation. Why this thing does that, I don't know. Anyway, back into the far, far away past. In other words, it essentially tells the Australian Aborigine society, whom he could have met had he bothered to travel to Australia. Gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, you are not from now. You are from Stone Age. And the fact that he, a Frenchman, not he necessarily, but the French anthropologists who went there, actually met these guys in person, doesn't bother him. That such is the power of the intellect. So essentially what happens is that otherness, in this case, the farthest away example of the possible cases of certain phenomenon in the world, will be folded intellectually back into the past, folding otherness into the past. Fabian, in his book, calls this process the denial of coevalness. Understand this well, that evil here, E-V-A-L, it's not evil as in good and evil, but evol as in evolution. So denial of coevalness means essentially interpreting contemporary societies as if they literally existed in the past and not in the present now. So by going physically to another society, you go into the past. Now, this is exactly what Durkheim does in his Sociology of the Religious Life. So I put his face here. So society, I'm going to call it L, is folded into the main line. It's just that it is folded into the very, very bottom of the main line, the darkest historical past. And you can repeat this. If you're diligent enough, you can keep folding societies back into the point on the main path of history, where their past is supposedly something that had departed from the main line. Okay, so these guys will be, and both of these will be folded back to here. These four will be all folded back to here, and these will be folded back to here. As a result, you will get, there is a Hungarian there, right there. Okay, I'm sorry, I missed that one somehow. Anyway, as a result, what you will get is a straight pointing, upward pointing, straight line arrow. Have you seen that before? Of course you have. That is progress. So the bewildering, beautiful, chaotic complexity of human history as it manifests itself in the contemporary form, available for comparative global historical sociology, is now reduced to a single line that goes from the absolute darkest, most primitive, simplest and most primitive, this is the language that Durkheim keeps saying or using, past. Everybody is folded back into that. It's just that they are folded into different stages in that past. It says in Hungarian, mindenki más beleforgatva a fővonalba, everybody else has been folded into the main line, right? So there's no evolutionary model anymore. What you have is a straight pointing, upward pointing arrow. In other words, we can say that folding otherness into the past is now a success. And I could not resist putting this picture of somebody, I think he must be from the Amazon, although I'm not sure, putting on his tribal makeup with a cell phone, because he's in the past. He needs to be in the past because the anthropologists are coming. Okay, so So what this essentially does is comparative historical sociology in the Western modality reduces complexity of the world, denies coevalness to all societies, denies the fact that they have all lived together in the world through the tens of thousands of years of collective human history, and they are part of the present. Okay, I'm sorry, there was some, I heard some noise there. Anyway, it denies that. And so it works with this incredibly streamlined single straight line model of history. What this does is that the main strength of this kind of top to bottom comparative historical social science, the main strength of it is pointing at the other's weaknesses or the absences, or all the things that are negative about them. That's what it means to be successful. Why? Because everybody, except for the identity position at the top, everybody else is part of the past. Only we at the top, we're the only ones in the present. Why are they doing this? Well, they're doing this because in folding the rest of humanity into this main line, it becomes possible to measure their distance, to measure the degree of backwardness or undevelopment of the other. So I put this tool here. Sorry about the heavy image here. This is exactly what the concept of modernity does for modernization theory. Okay, here's another, what a nice slip here, no? However, but then I put Weber in there. Sorry about that. Maybe I'll keep that. There's a joke in there somewhere. I just don't know what. Anyway, so modernization theory, which was the name of theory for the social sciences between the 1920s, when Talcott Parsons arrived in Heidelberg a few years after Weber's death, and discovered the light and started to translate Weber into English and simplified Weber tremendously. That's the beginning of modernization theory, and it lasted at least until the late 60s, although even today there are remnants of that left and right. So there has been this approach called modernization theory. One of the greatest representatives of it of all times is this incredibly impressive historical sociologist by the name Shmuel Eisenstadt, who was at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem for 5 decades, something like that. And then he, sometime around the turn of the 21st century, published a little project of his, first in German, actually, Die Vielfalt der Moderne, and then it came out in English, Multiple Modernities. And in that project, he basically, Eisenstadt, one of the greatest fathers of modernization theory ever, recanted some of his, withdrew some of his most important convictions. He essentially made 3 main points. One is he admitted that the classics plus classical modernization theory all assume, even if only implicitly, that the cultural program of modernity as it developed in modern Europe and the basic institutional constellations that emerged there would ultimately take over in all modernizing and modern societies. With the expansion of modernity, they would prevail throughout the world. In other words, modernity would be sooner or later generic, universal, and all human feature. It's only a matter of time before those who are not quite modern yet, supposedly, catch up. He admitted that they said that. And then he had to face the fact that the actual developments in modernizing societies have refuted the homogenizing and hegemonic assumptions of the Western program. And so the Western programs of patterns of modernity are not the only authentic modernities. though they enjoy historic precedence and continue to be a basic reference point. Why did he have to face this? Why did he have to acknowledge this at, whatever, the 45th year or 50th year of his career? Well, he did this because he had to face the criticisms that came from within his own perspective, that there is Japan, there is South Korea, there is Taiwan, Hong Kong. There are these societies which are incredibly quote unquote successful, meaning they're rich and becoming richer and richer, and they cannot possibly be described as Western. There's nothing Western about Japanese capitalism, actually, or Korean. I can't get into that, but there's actually quite a nice discussion of that all over comparative economic sociology. That's what made him decide that. However, he gave up his earlier dogma, but he retained still the idea that societies are contained units, self-contained units, meaning they don't have any interaction with each other. They're all like athletes in the marathon running a competition of the Olympics. Let their best runner win. That's exactly how the world is, according to him. There's no connection among them. And of course, he also retained culture as a combination of tradition and modernity that as the only meaningful explanation for all this. So that was a compromise, but it's a small step. But at least he gave up the unilinear directional model. Now, this brings us to what I suspect might be of interest to those of you that are not from Western Europe. And that is what to do if the reality you're working with, you cannot put it at the top of the achievement scale. Well, there are basically two conversations. One is that there is the West and there is the East. There's one model that says that they are the same substance. Oh, here's another Hungarian here. That's actually, it makes no sense in Hungarian or English either, but never mind that. So here, same substance and drab quality, meaning let's say Eastern Europe is the same substance as Western Europe, only shitty quality. Another way to approach, which is fervently in debate with this, says that no, it's different substance. What this does to our model is this: the analyst's identity position is not a peak achievement. Peak achievement is up here. The analyst's identity position, talking about, I don't know, Hungary, in our case, would be here. What does that do? Well, what it does is that, for instance, East Central European sociology has a tendency to retain the teleological model, retains the claim that the peak achievement is somewhere else, and that is, of course, the West. In other words, it's not the analyst's own location. A great example of this is the famous opposition politician from Poland, Adam Michnik, who had this really very witty, I think wrong, but never mind, witty point, quoting Lech Wałęsa, that we must deal with the well-known problem of the difference between an aquarium and a fish soup. We know how to make fish soup out of an aquarium, but the reverse not so much. And he said this at the point of the collapse of state socialism. In other words, this is basically an articulation of the different substance position. So what followed, certainly in the post-state socialist period in East Central Europe and former Soviet Union to a large extent, was a demand to fold ourselves into the past, specifically into the past of others. So our future is going to be somebody else's successful past. This past is seen as very successful. So what we need to do, there's no way to go. If you can look at the cursor on the screen for a moment, this is where we are. There's no way to go from here to here directly. So we have to go back here and then climb up there. Okay, our future is somebody else's successful past. Of course, what this involved on the popular level was a demand that, please, somebody give us all the advantages and the admirable things about that great peak achievement here. And in exchange, we will ignore all the disadvantages and the negative aspects of the peak achievers, even though we know them very well because we are their servants. We clean their houses. Now, that claim that there is no way to go from here to here without going back to the past and then claiming back up there is actually not correct. There was this economic historian by the name Alexander Gerschenkron. Gerschenkron was a student of German and Russian and Soviet economic history, and he actually argued that there was this thing called the latecomer's advantage. It was actually possible that a society that is disadvantaged in certain respect to some other society can actually catch up relatively efficiently and quickly, as long as it does not repeat the mistakes of the top achievers in the past. So for Gerschenkron, the whole point of the latecomer's advantage is never to go back here. He would cut this link. Never go back there, because if you do, then you just keep repeating all the dead ends and the mistakes that the peak achievers went through. But that, in order to be able to go up like that, make a shortcut, you have to be creative. There needs to be a certain level of social creativity. In the case of Germany, which was, believe it or not, at that time seen as a backward country economically, in that case, it was the invention of a certain kind of industrial development bank and the state's very elevated role in the development of private capital, which was basically the meat of Gerschenkron's analysis of the German history. Anyway, so this is not that relevant. Okay, so the main problem is that this container society model, single society not connected to others, only works if the society is on the right-hand side here in the present are linked to each other. Or I'm sorry, if they are not linked to each other, only through their past. However, we know that that's not actually true, because the world economy looks kind of like this. It's a network model. Therefore, all these elements here, we should represent all the present on the right-hand side of Spencer's model. And we should represent as a network model where there's a dense global interconnectedness going on. That, of course, is not unheard of, because that's pretty much exactly what Immanuel Wallerstein and his colleagues starting in the early 70s have been proposing. That goes under the name of world systems analysis. There are other sub-areas of sociology that work with that. But we ignore that in our own comparative historical models for about 98% of the time. And in conclusion, I wanted to point out a couple of things that we could be doing even within the container society, even if we ignore the network connectedness business. And that, for instance, an example that I brought is a book that Anthony Giddens, this sort of neoliberal, middle-of-the-road politician and sociologist, if you can call him that way, a former president of the London School of Economics, former chief expert of the Prime Minister of Britain. His book, Introduction Sociology book, has been published in Hungarian, and when it came out, I wrote a review of it in Magyar and in English, and this is the concluding paragraph, the 2 paragraphs of that criticism that summarizes my point about this. So what it is that we could do even in the absence of a more ambitious network model. Well, we can tell the story of the damage that Giddens's book does by enumerating what the Hungarian student will fail to learn from his book. Besides the elementary facts of Hungarian society, basic knowledge about demography, sociology of the family, and so on, he or she will not know what lies behind those concepts brought by Hungarian sociology to universal as well as Hungarian sociological discourse. And in the Hungarian version, I gave a long list of those, which I cannot repeat here because I can't assume that you're familiar with that. The point is that in a certain way, that is actually our job as sociologists coming from a particular place. We actually must engage our contextual knowledge to enrich the global comparative historical sociological conversation without the condescending top to bottom, west to the rest image. Another thing that we could do and should do, and this is where I really am concluding, is steadfastly and with a lot of energy keep bringing in people from outside the Western canon. One example is something that a friend of mine who works at the National University of Singapore, whose name is Syed Farid Alatas, who is a Malaysian sociologist. He's written his entire, a huge part of his work on this 14th century North African traveler and writer by the name Ibn Khaldun. Khaldun's main book, the Muqaddimah, actually survived. It has been translated, including English. It's a fantastically interesting early sociological treatise of the then known Muslim world. Why don't we teach it in classical sociology? I cannot give any rational explanation other than the fact that we don't particularly care, because he was from Africa, he is Muslim, and not white, maybe. Another person, just to jump in historical time, is somebody I do teach quite a bit, is Piotr Kropotkin, who was not only the father of anarchism, but also very much a forerunner of a particular approach to animal behavior, which has very profound implications for human behavior vis-a-vis the animal kingdom. Turn of the 19th to 20th centuries, Russian, French, British context. Another person that is really rarely discussed, I first heard of her way in the US, is Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a British founder of what is called feminism today. Another, nobody has ever heard of. I happen to come across her work because of family connections. I have links to India for quite some time in my previous life. Is Rokeya Sakhavat Hussain, who is a Bengali intellectual. This was a Bengali Muslim woman who lived in Parda, seclusion, who wrote fantastically, scathingly, bitingly sarcastic, ironical feminist work in the context of the famous Bengal Renaissance in the early part of the 20th century. In English, there's actually no excuse not to know her. Another person that Syed Farid Alatas teaches, and I know of him through this friend of mine, is Jose Rizal, who was a polymath, novelist, and a revolutionary leader of the Philippine and liberation struggle against the Spanish. He was executed by the Spaniards, by the way, in 1896, just a few years before the Americans entered the Philippines and colonized it to replace the Spaniards. His novel, Noli Me Tangere, is a fantastic, beautiful sociological analysis of colonial society, also available in English. For those of us from Hungary, I'm not assuming anybody else has heard his name, is Lajos Leopold Jr., an early 20th century classic, at least as interesting, if not more, as Max Weber, in my humble opinion, only his Leopold's work was considerably smaller in size and not translated into world languages nearly as much. And finally, I'm also putting in there B.R. Ambedkar, who was, of course, a legal scholar, a Dalit intellectual, who was the drafter of the independent Indian constitution. But the reason I'm mentioning him is that he wrote a fantastic set of books about caste, which is a classical sociological contribution if I ever saw one. And with all that, this would, but please keep in mind this, that there must be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other people like that. And it is our job, essentially your generation's job, to find out who they are and how they contribute and how we can reform, sort of reshape the way in which sociology